Elves. They are one of the most iconic archetypes in modern fantasy, one of the mascots of the genre. Fantasy fans have, well, a bit of a love-hate relationship with them, but on the whole, the love seems to overshadow the hate because they keep appearing in franchise after franchise. Normally, when a fantasy trope gets repeated this many times, it becomes heavily standardized. If all of you close your eyes and imagine an elf, you should all have the exact same vision in your head. Or do you? You see, I started thinking about this when I saw a tweet making the rounds from Oliver Darkshire. I sort of love how fantasy as a genre can't decide if elves are really short, kinda short, a bit tall, or really tall, but everyone knows that dwarves are exactly 4 feet and 6 inches. Now, when it comes to the dwarves, we can loop back around to them later. Let's be honest, no one really cares about dwarves, we don't have to spend that much time on them. Likewise, when it comes to the really short elves, the type that live in the North Pole or bake cookies in trees, maybe we can disregard them as well. We usually see them as belonging to a separate class of creature from the more substantial elves you see in high fantasy. But even narrowing down our range like that, we have a lot of variation. Obviously, you have the tall, elegant, noble elves that tower above the lesser races of men. They are absolutely iconic. Legolas, Deedlit, Sylvanas Windrunner. But you also see elves that are a bit more on the small and lithe side, usually standing just a little bit shorter than the average human. And some of them are very popular as well. Just think of Frieren, Marsil, Zevran Arani, who, now that I say his name out loud, maybe isn't quite as popular as Frieren or Marsil, but he really ought to be. And when I started laying it out like this, I realized that there's a pretty clear chronological divide. Taller elves are dominant in earlier classic fantasy, but then, from maybe around 2010 or so, they've been getting a lot shorter. So I kept adding more and more examples, and while there are exceptions, the overall trend is very consistent. We need to ask ourselves, are elves shrinking? This might seem frivolous because, well, objectively it is, but hear me out. Elves are, again, one of the mascots of fantasy. They are, surely, an indicator species of any wider changes going on in the genre. If they are getting smaller, who knows what the wider implications might be. And I think this technically counts as a video essay, which means we need some context. The natural place to start would be by talking about the original elves in folklore and mythology. Most people tend to point to the fragmentary mentions of the Ulfar in Norse mythology, but you could just as easily talk about the Anglo-Saxon Ulfae, the Sidhe in Ireland, the Tylwyth Teg in Wales, the Fae in France. There's a lot of very similar stories that exist across cultures that diverge from each other, then cross-pollinate, and evolve in all sorts of different ways. By the time we get to England in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the word elf has become synonymous with fairy, basically an umbrella term to describe any kind of otherworldly spirit that isn't exactly demonic or angelic. Sometimes they were seen as something frivolous and whimsical, like in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream or Drayton's Nymphidia. Sometimes they were meant to embody a sense of transcendental beauty and nobility, like Spenser's The Fairy Queen or the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer. And, of course, in a lot of folk traditions, they were primarily seen as something to be feared, something you need to ward off with cold iron, lest they come into your house at night and steal your children away. Elves were the embodiment of magic, of fantasy, and that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, at least until we get to the 17 and 1800s, when the Age of Enlightenment smashes old traditions and superstitions, and it becomes hard to see something like an elf as anything other than ridiculous. Fairy tales become something that is mainly valued as children's entertainment. All these diverse traditions get winnowed down into something that will be cute, innocent, playful. The main vision of elves in the popular consciousness is as these little silly guys with pointy ears and pointy hats. And because this era is also when the character of Santa Claus emerges as we know him today, it's only natural to give him a squadron of elven helpers, which, needless to say, has remained a very enduring image. But this idea that fantasy was only fit to create a sense of childlike whimsy, it didn't quite sit right with everyone, and well, I have a whole other video if you're really interested, but suffice to say, we started to see the archetype of the more substantial, noble elf emerge in works like Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter, or Poul Anderson's The Broken Sword. But, well, let's be honest, it was only one man who managed to have a lasting impact on the popular consciousness. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was a man who enjoyed inventing languages, but at a certain point he thought it would be even more fun to invent a people who could actually speak that language. He called them the Quendi, which, appropriately enough, translates into the speakers. He wrote about them in a way that evoked the enchanting, elevated, alluring vision of the fantastic, like you see in The Fairy Queen or Thomas the Rhymer. The Quendi are wise, they are immortal, they are fair to look upon, they have a noble bearing, they are skilled at war and smithing and art and poetry and basically anything else you can imagine. We mortals can only really look up at them with awe and reverence, and when I say look up at them, I mean it very literally. Their women all apparently stand above 180 centimeters, and the men upwards of 2 meters. This seemed like a bit of a personal fixation for Tolkien. Good, important, noble people are always described as being very tall. Even Frodo apparently stood a bit higher than the average hobbit. You could say that Tolkien's elves represent an authentic tradition re-emerging after being bastardized by the Victorians, or you could say that Tolkien represents just another bastardization, and you need to turn to either Lord Dunsany or Poul Anderson for elves done right. Or you might think that there was nothing wrong with Victorian elves in the first place, and this is all just a hullabaloo over nothing. But for his part, Tolkien never claimed that his elves were the one true proper depiction. To him, they were simply the Quendi, a completely invented people. But when he was writing these stories down, he felt he might as well give them an English name to connect them to older mythological traditions. You can see that a lot of these terms were still considered to be pretty interchangeable, in that in his early drafts he plays around with calling them gnomes or fairies, before he eventually settles on elves. They technically make their debut in The Hobbit, but next to all the dwarves and dragons and goblins and shapeshifters, they don't stand out terribly much. It's in The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien is much more intentional, with characters like Elrond, Galadriel, and Legolas, in emphasizing them as fair, noble, enchanted, in a way that puts them above the other races. Within the cosmology of Middle-earth, they are quite literally not of this world. They are supposed to be returning to the undying lands of Valinor, and you're meant to feel that disconnect. And with the massive popularity of The Lord of the Rings, there was now a new popular archetype. The Victorian ideal of the cute, diminutive elves would obviously still continue on, but we usually interpret this as the same name being applied to two completely separate things. When the tiny elves show up in fantasy, we usually interpret them as a completely separate type of creature, so the Tolkien-esque elf. And we all know that those elves, the proper fantasy elves, are tall. Right? In the 1970s, a little something hit shelves called Dungeons and Dragons. Did you like The Lord of the Rings? How about a game where you and your friends can get together and pretend to be elves? Dungeons & Dragons is probably the most single important media franchise in solidifying our idea of the standard fantasy setting. The common set of tropes that you can just copy and paste into any fantasy story with no questions asked. But in large part, its influence is kind of invisible, because most people don't really see it as creating something new, just bringing together lots of different elements from pre-existing fantasy franchises. I mean, the elves, dwarves, and orcs are obviously just taken straight from Tolkien with no modification. Except, wait a second, what's going on here? If you open your AD&D Player's Handbook, you'll see an illustration where the elf is a full head shorter than the human, and this isn't an anomaly. It goes all the way back to the original chainmail rules. If we want to understand what's going on here, then luckily, Gary Gygax, the main guy in charge of the whole enterprise, lived long enough to get on the internet and answer questions on forums like N-World and Dragon's Foot. Or actually, the fact that he did this is in many ways rather unlucky for his lasting reputation, but it is quite fortunate for our purposes at least. Now, if you're into D&D trivia, then you'll know that Gary Gygax didn't actually like The Lord of the Rings. His preferred brand of fantasy was more Conan the Barbarian, but he knew that there were more Tolkien fans out there than Robert E. Howard fans, so he threw in some elves, dwarves, and orcs, basically as a marketing ploy to lure them in. But he was always very insistent that he wasn't copying Tolkien. He was simply creating his own set of fantasy races that just happened to have the same names, but were based on his own interpretation of folklore and mythology. And here, you might say that he's protesting a little bit too much, but it is true that if you read what the rulebooks actually say about elves, they seem a little bit less like Tolkien's, and harken back to traditions that see them as essentially a bunch of whimsical nature spirits. Often considered flighty or frivolous, they like to frolic in the woods, sing, recite poetry, and seemingly don't have any ambitions beyond this. And that isn't exactly antithetical to Tolkien's elves. You know, they do love nature, they definitely have been known to sing and frolic. But the other parts of Tolkien's elf lore, the parts about them being wise and noble and great warriors and craftsmen, that's all been very deliberately downplayed. Part of Gary Gygax's world-building philosophy is that humans should always be the strongest, most dominant race. He wanted his settings to feel grounded and relatable, and to have these semi-angelic elves sitting around as the ultimate font of power and wisdom, that wasn't really compatible with his philosophy. He needed to have something close enough to the Tolkien elf that it would bring the Lord of the Rings fans to the table, but he also made sure to bring them down a peg, bring them just a little bit closer to the diminutive Victorian elf. Something smaller, something that isn't so high and mighty, something that you don't have to take so seriously. So in addition to the Tolkienian elf, we now have the Gygaxian elf, and we are just getting started. The 80s, 90s, and early 2000s is when we really see elves take over the fantasy genre, sparked in no small part by the popularity of D&D providing this ready-made standard template. They were all over the place in books, TTRPGs, and video games. And it seems like everyone wanted to put their own twist on it. You've got the wise, enlightened, benevolent elves of the inheritance cycle against the myopically arrogant elves of Warhammer, the snooty, upper-class elves of Shadowrun against the simple, nomadic elves of the Devery cycle, the tyrannical, imperialistic elves of the Deathgate cycle or the Half-Blood Chronicles versus the marginalized elves of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn or The Witcher. You've got high high elves, wood elves, dark elves, and I don't know how many other varieties. But the one thing that the vast majority of these franchises could agree on, even those that otherwise took a lot of influence from D&D, is that elves ought to be tall. They were willing to play around with a lot of other stuff, but this was simply non-negotiable. And well, that is kind of interesting, isn't it? On one hand, elves are a completely fictional people. You are free to portray them however you want. You could have a race of sapient tree people and stick the label of elf on them like RuneQuest does. But generally, when you choose to invoke a trope that has all these pre-existing connotations from previous works, it's generally expected that you'll stay within certain parameters. I mean, just look at the other main fantasy race. When it comes to dwarves, you can talk about all the different varieties in traditional folklore. You could talk about how Tolkien's dwarves were actually a lot more nuanced than people usually think. But let's be honest, at the point we've reached in modern fantasy, all dwarves are exactly the same. The dwarven party member is one of those stock characters that you can copy and paste into any setting. He's gruff and stubborn, but dependable and unpretentious. He's got a lot of raw strength and skill with the axe, but he's probably not very dexterous or magically inclined. He's handy and practical, but maybe not very imaginative. Going back to the tweet that started this all, we've got dwarves pretty well figured out. We know that they are great miners and warriors, so they can't get too short, or else they wouldn't have that raw strength. But they also can't get too tall, or else, well, they wouldn't be dwarves anymore, would they? About 140 centimeters is the perfect height for them. Like a lot of stock characters, the archetypical dwarf isn't very interesting. Very few people feel strongly about him one way or the other, but he serves the purpose he's meant to serve. He's very well balanced in terms of his abilities and personality in a way that adds to the group dynamic. He has been perfectly optimized for that purpose, to the point that no more changes are really necessary. And so, whenever someone does try to come up with a new take on dwarves, it does get some attention for sheer novelty value, but it doesn't really catch on in the same way as all the various varieties of elves, because elves are in the exact opposite boat. The original elves, the elves of the Lord of the Rings, are meant to be alluring and enchanting in a way that dwarves simply aren't. But the thing is, their design is as these angelic beings, these distant figures of grace and beauty, which is all well and good when they're distant, but when you give elves an actual role in the story and have them interact with lesser races, well, then you realize that having to spend time with someone who's ethereally beautiful and better than you in every way is really infuriating. A lot of people already think that Tolkien's elves are rather annoying, and that same archetype put in the hands of a lesser author would become absolutely unsufferable. But it does seem like most authors intuitively know this. They know they can't just copy and paste from Tolkien. They have to adjust it, change things around, add in some flaws, some rough edges, in a way that keeps what makes them alluring without making them insufferable. The Gygaxian elf was an early attempt to find a balance, but it went a bit too far. From my experience, most D&D players either haven't read the rules or have chosen to ignore them. The nobility, the grandeur, and by extension the height is precisely what they love about elves. I think the best case study for this is the classic MMO World of Warcraft. Now, for full transparency, I'm not a WoW player. Having strangers on the internet yell at me for not healing fast enough isn't really my idea of a good time. But I have been reading up on some lore, I have seen some videos, and I do find World of Warcraft to be quite interesting in how it distills all of these fantasy archetypes and heightens them. How unafraid it is of being big, bold, colorful, and honestly, kind of tacky. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they have what are probably the tallest elves in any major fantasy franchise. The Night Elves in particular can easily stand over 210 centimeters, which in addition to their very sharp, angular features and unnatural skin tones means you really can't mistake them for anything else. They are grand, they are noble, they are beautiful. They sit atop an ancient civilization with thousands of years worth of history. But they also aren't necessarily the wise and benevolent elves of the Lord of the Rings. If anything, a better comparison would be to the rash and vengeful elves of the Silmarillion. Now, on the whole, I'd still definitely say that they're more good than evil, but it is true that they can be proud and arrogant, that many of them have lusted for power to disastrous results. They are at the center of so many wars and global calamities. I don't think you could really describe them as being better than humanity, though I think you could definitely say that they are cooler than humanity. Even their worst aspects are so heightened and dramatic that they become awesome. They absolutely steal the spotlight from any other races. For Gary Gygax, this would be an absolute nightmare, but if you're a committed elf fan, then this is pure heroin. And if that's true, then I'm willing to bet that there's very few recent works of fantasy that have given you quite that same hit. Now, to be fair, it's hard to make definitive statements about trends in modern fantasy because there's so many different mediums and subgenres and insular communities that you can't really keep track of them all. But that being said, I made an effort of coming up with a well-balanced list of some of the most popular and influential fantasy media in the past 10 or 15 years where elves play a major role in the story. Depending on what corners you hang out in, you might think that there's some entries I should add or remove, but on the whole, I think the general trends will remain consistent. Elf height is a lot more balanced than it used to be. There's still tall elves around, but they are hardly dominant. And that's even with me padding out their numbers with stuff like Amazon's Rings of Power, which is really scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of cultural relevance. Whereas the short elves have absolute heavy hitters like Dungeon Meshi and Freeran. So you gotta ask, what happened? Well, to start off with, we need to address the big titty elephant in the room, which is that there is a lot of anime on this list. I'm not even necessarily a huge anime fan. Some of the stuff that's on this list I hadn't even heard of before I started researching this video, but they seem to have a large audience. In the past couple decades, anime and manga have gone from being a relatively marginal part of Anglosphere nerd culture to achieving practical hegemony. And if we're talking about elves in Japanese media, then the defining work would have to be Record of Lotus War, the D&D campaign turn novel turn 1990 anime, and specifically the elf party member / love interest, Dietlit, the breakout character of the series. Many would describe her as best girl. And anything that's popular in anime is bound to have imitators, so the female elf love interest has become a common, recurring character that appears in any D&D style fantasy series. Now, Dietlit herself, she's definitely not a giant like the Warcraft elves. They weren't bold enough to let her stand any higher than the human male lead Parn, but even then, she's still depicted as being generally on the taller side. I mean, just look at her, she has got legs for weeks. Yet, over time, that aspect of her character design has not been consistently replicated. Just as the Victorians wanted their elves to be small and cute, anime fans have a very similar attitude towards their waifus. And if I had to guess, I would say that this is a major reason why modern anime elves tend to be a bit on the shorter side, or at least no taller than humans. So is that what we're looking at here? We have the tall, elegant Western elf against the moe Eastern elf. I think that might explain part of it, but it doesn't give us the full picture. If we return to this list and remove anime from the equation, then that brings the median height up by quite a bit. but it still doesn't feel overwhelming, if only because we have such a limited sample size. In the past 10 years, there's been a boom in depictions of elves in anime and manga, to the point that we barely notice that they've become a lot less common in Western books, video games, and TV shows. Try coming up with some that have come out during that time, which I don't already have on the list. If you're a real connoisseur, then maybe you'll be able to rattle them off from the top of your head. But for most of you, I imagine you'll be blanking after about one or two. And this definitely isn't because we have a shortage of Western fantasy. This is the same era as Game of Thrones, Brandon Sanderson, the YA publishing boom. Fantasy is perhaps more popular now than it has ever been. But one thing that you might have noticed is that a lot of that popularity has only come after jettisoning a lot of elements of classic fantasy that mainstream audiences would consider to be a bit too nerdy. You don't see a lot of fantasy series these days starting off with some grand narration about an ancient prophecy. You don't hear characters talking in that stilted, cheesy yet self-serious style that you'll hear if you listen to the dialogue in a World of Warcraft cutscene. Modern fantasy is grounded and relatable. This might mean being dark and gritty like Game of Thrones, or it might mean being more lighthearted and self-aware. Like I said, I don't keep close track of fantasy isekai, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the minds behind Reborn as a Vending Machine, I Now Wander the Dungeon maybe aren't taking themselves very seriously. And for a lot of people, the archetypical fantasy races are one of those things that just seems too cheesy. Especially with elves. Having this super special race of people who are just like humans but cooler, that's not really conducive to a grounded, relatable story. A lot of the time, this means getting rid of them altogether. But if for whatever reason you're particularly attached to having them in your setting, then it's very tempting to just take the Gygax approach and knock them down a peg. You can see what's probably the most dramatic example of this in the Dragon Age video game series. These were developed by a team at BioWare who had previously worked on the original Baldur's Gate series set in the D&D Forgotten Realms universe, and from there they carried over the character design element to have the elves be a little bit shorter. But these aren't much like the original Gygaxian elves. The premise of Dragon Age, at least at the beginning of the series, is as a dark, gritty fantasy. There's not as much room for whimsy or frivolity. Here, elves are presented as a degraded race. Once, they were a great and mighty civilization like in Tolkien. But the thing is, in the Lord of the Rings, the elves were also explicitly in decline. They embody a type of pure, primordial magic that is fading away in the modern world. So, Dragon Age does something similar to what we've seen in The Witcher or Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. It takes this idea to its logical conclusion, and it presents a setting where the elves have totally fallen and have been subjugated by the upstart race of man. There's a lot of very intentional parallels to Celtic and Native American peoples, which also has been the source of many arguments which are beyond the scope of this video. But, in principle at least, you can see how it naturally flows from the classic elven archetype. And you can also see how their shorter stature emphasizes their status as the underdog, up against the tyrannical human barbarians who literally tower above them. It's a relatively minor detail in the grand scheme of things, but it makes them just a little bit easier to empathize with. It prods the audience to root for them just a little bit harder. And if you look for other examples of short elves, they might not go to the same extremes, but they have the same guiding philosophy. If we turn towards anime and manga, then, well, first of all, the elf that's just there as a love interest can't look too intimidating, but we can also see it in, well, let's be frank, actually good stories, such as Dungeon Meshi. Here we have the complete opposite of Dragon Age. These elves are wealthy, powerful, long-lived. They exert hegemony over the lesser races. It would be very fitting for them to stand tall to symbolize this, but instead, they're usually about a head shorter than humans, portrayed in a way that, even when they're hundreds of years old, makes them seem almost childlike. Now, I don't claim to have any special insights to Ryoko Kui's intentions, but I do know that Dungeon Meshi is a series with well-developed characters that asks you to empathize with them, even in cases where initially they might not seem sympathetic. If we saw a tall, arrogant elf just walking around lording it over everyone like this, the audience would come to hate them pretty quickly. They'd just be completely obnoxious. But seeing this type of behavior from someone who, at first glance, seems like they'd be innocent and childlike, there's a disconnect. It puts us just a little bit on edge and stops us from making a snap judgment. It makes them more intriguing. It makes us want to dig deeper and figure out what's really going on here. And you can see that same disconnect on full display with Frieren, probably the most iconic elf of the 2020s. The series emphasizes her as an immortal being who fundamentally experiences the passage of time differently from humans. But it also deeply needs us to empathize with her, to see her as relatable. And to give her a small and cute appearance to contrast against her ancient wisdom, well, that accomplishes the goal pretty effectively. And when it comes to modern fantasy that still goes for Toll elves, it's often an extension of the same principle. In these cases, the elves aren't supposed to be relatable. You aren't supposed to put yourself in their shoes. Obviously, there are the Tholmor from Skyrim, who are exactly what the Canaries from Dungeon Meshi could have been. A group of obnoxious one-dimensional villains who you're supposed to immediately hate. And the fact that they just snootily tower above you is just one more thing that really drives home that impression. But a more complex example would be the character of Sabile from Divinity Original Sin 2. She's one of the party members. You're supposed to get to know her and grow to like her, but it's also meant to be a bit of a challenge to get to that point. Because the lore around elves in this game is rather strange, she is a ruthless cannibal who's hell-bent on revenge and doesn't play very nice with others. She's set up as one of the more difficult party members, and her being over 2 meters tall is just one more thing that alienates her from the player. She's not meant to be immediately likable in the same way as Frieren. If she at first comes off as strange and off-putting, then that's exactly the point. So, have we settled on a dichotomy now? We have our more relatable, likable short elves versus the colder, more distant tall elves. Personally, I think it holds up pretty well, but if you dig further, you can always find exceptions. I haven't even touched the topic of fairy romance, which I've heard is quite popular in certain circles. It seemed out of scope for a discussion about elves, but, well, the line between fairies and elves has historically been loose, and seeing how they're described in these books, we might be reaching another convergence point. But that's a topic for another day. These types of trends are always changing, and there's always time for them to reverse. What are your thoughts? Do you think we need more tall elves, short elves, or maybe we need to put a break on elves altogether? Until the next time, Namarie.